It didn't happen with shouting. No fists slammed, no voices raised, just one woman, sitting in a chair beneath the hot studio lights, holding a folded piece of paper, and a truth that no one expected her to say out loud. In a modest TV studio in Phoenix, where the makeup was fresh and the camera steady, a panel discussion turned into a national reckoning. A congresswoman from Texas, barely shifting in her seat, asked a question that made time pause. Across from her sat a woman who had built a brand on defiance, but for the first time in a long time, she had no words. What happens when someone who once cried for protection tells the next generation that racism is just a card being played? This story isn't just about two women in disagreement. It's about history, the kind we live through, and the kind we're told to forget. It's about silence and who breaks it first. It's about the moment when performance meets principle, and the whole country holds its breath. So today, we go back to that room, not for the drama, but for what it revealed. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And when the lights came on, the real story had only just begun. The room wasn't loud, not yet, but something about the silence felt rehearsed, like everyone knew what was coming, but no one knew exactly when it would arrive. The studio lights above hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over four chairs set in a clean arc, like pieces on a board waiting to be moved. The air was too still, too measured. Even the makeup artist, who had just finished her final touch-ups, moved with the kind of reverence you see in places where noise doesn't belong. Cathedrals, courtrooms, or moments right before something breaks. Cameras were already rolling, quietly tracking every shift, every blink. The moderator's face was calm, but his fingers tapped an almost imperceptible rhythm against the desk. Producers stood just beyond the curtain, exchanging glances and hand signals. Not chaotic, not panicked, but tightly coordinated, like conductors preparing for an orchestra that might veer off sheet music at any moment. Something in the air said, "This won't go the way we rehearsed." And then she adjusted her sleeve. Jasmine Crockett didn't fidget, not the way nervous people do. She moved with purpose, as if even the adjustment of a cuff was calculated. Her blazer was a deep cobalt blue, not flashy, but undeniable. The kind of color that doesn't whisper to the room. It commands attention. She sat tall, back straight, legs neatly crossed, but her posture wasn't stiff. It was deliberate, composed, like someone who'd been underestimated before and decided to make stillness her weapon. Across from her sat Candace Owens, smile sharp as glass, legs angled with practiced elegance, eyes scanning like a hawk. She wasn't here to be caught off guard. She never was. This was her terrain, the soundstage, the spotlight, the sharpened retorts. But tonight, something was off. Not in her words, not in her makeup, not even in her confidence, but in the energy that had started to shift before the first question was asked. The set was built for debate, but this night wasn't going to be about exchange. It was going to be about exposure. The backdrop glowed with patriotic blue and red, and the show's logo, Real America, pulsed faintly on the wall. It was a late-night segment on WJTX, a Phoenix affiliate known for its confrontational panels and a reputation for no safe zones. Everyone knew what that meant. If you were sitting in one of those chairs, you'd better be ready to bleed metaphorically and recover fast. But what the producers hadn't planned for, what the audience at home couldn't yet see, was that tonight someone wasn't coming to survive the segment. They were coming to shift the entire conversation. That someone was Jasmine Crockett. She didn't need the stage. She didn't crave the heat of the lights, but she was here because something needed to be said. Not for applause, not for trend lines, but for the stories that never made it to television. She carried them with her, in the line of her jaw, in the steady quiet of her breath. The stories of kids who got followed through grocery stores, of women who changed their names on resumes to sound more hireable, of men pulled over for the crime of fitting a description. She didn't speak for them with slogans. She carried them like gravity. The tension wasn't spoken yet, but it lived in the glances exchanged, in the way Candace leaned just slightly forward as if trying to preempt a blow that hadn't landed. The moderator shuffled his notes, buying time. But time was already shifting, because this wasn't going to be one of those neat, packaged debates where both sides walk away with applause lines and clever hashtags. Number this night would be remembered, not because of what was shouted, but because of what was finally said out loud, clearly, calmly, without blinking. And Jasmine Crockett was ready. The lights didn't flicker when she walked in. The cameras didn't pan dramatically. There was no music swell, no dramatic pause, no whispered gas. But her entrance was felt, not seen, not heard. Felt. Jasmine Crockett stepped onto that stage not like a guest, but like someone returning to a familiar battlefield. One she didn't choose, but one she had prepared for her entire life. The audience wouldn't know it yet, but they were about to witness the quietest declaration of war ever made on live television. She didn't raise a voice. She didn't raise a fist. She simply wore a cobalt blazer. Not navy, not black. Cobalt. It was intentional. Cobalt is a color that says, "You will see me," but doesn't scream for it. It commands, not begs. It reflects light without trying. And under those searing studio bulbs, Jasmine's blazer didn't sparkle. It stood firm, like armor. But it wasn't just the blazer. It was the way she sat in it. Shoulders squared, spine anchored, expression measured. Her eyes didn't scan the room in defense. They studied it, calmly. And when the moderator welcomed her with that polite, slightly guarded Congresswoman Crockett, she didn't nod performatively or smile for the camera. She simply acknowledged it. Present, grounded, real. That calm was her superpower. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was full. Of history. Of purpose. Of names you don't know but should. She wasn't there as Jasmine the lawmaker. She was there as Jasmine the witness. The vessel. Because she didn't come alone. She never does. She carried every constituent who never got their story told. The mother whose son never came home from the corner store. The teacher who had to cut off her locks to keep her job. The teenage girl suspended for raising her voice because it made others uncomfortable. They don't trend. They don't go viral. But Jasmine carries them anyway. In the way she speaks with clarity and in the way she doesn't speak unless it matters. Tonight, everything mattered. It wasn't a panel. It wasn't a debate. It was testimony. And her presence, not loud, not flashy, was the warning before the storm. She knew Candace would be polished, confident, rehearsed. She respected that, but she didn't fear it, because poise is not performance. And Jasmine's kind of poise doesn't fade when the script ends. It's lived in, earned, the kind you carry when you spent years walking through rooms not built for your truth, only to reshape them with every step. That's what she brought into the studio. Not a message, but a mirror. One Candace Owens wouldn't be able to look away from. Because for all the stats, all the slogans, all the sharp sound bites that would fly across that stage in the next hour, Jasmine had one weapon Candace didn't expect. Memory. And not just her own. Collective memory of injustice, of contradiction, of the very system Candace once called on, and now claimed didn't exist. Jasmine didn't dress for the show. She dressed for the reckoning. And her cobalt blue, it wasn't fashion, it was a flag. The moderator leaned forward slightly, the edges of his cue cards trembling just enough to betray the tension. His voice was smooth, practiced, but there was a subtle tightening as he turned toward Jasmine. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "you've been outspoken about disparities in our justice system. But many, like Candace here, argue the system works as intended, and that race is too often used as a scapegoat. Your thoughts?" He phrased it gently, as if handing over something fragile. But the weight of the question landed hard, and everyone in the room felt it. The topic wasn't new. Race, criminal justice, personal responsibility. These were staples of political television. But this time, it was clear. This wasn't going to be just another roundtable. This wasn't about analysis. This was about control. Candace Owens sat ready. Her smile was quick, bright, and calculated. A signature trademark. Her heels were crossed just so, her shoulders angled to the camera, every movement perfectly measured for clarity and command. She jumped in before Jasmine could answer, her voice clipped and confident. "With respect, Congresswoman," Candace said, "I think it's dangerous when politicians lean into victimhood. This idea that everything bad that happens to Black Americans is rooted in racism. It's dishonest. I'm living proof that it isn't." She paused, letting the words settle like a teacher ending a lecture. Somewhere off camera, a producer nodded slightly. That was the line they were waiting for. The brand in full force. The idea that systemic racism is a narrative to be unlearned. In personal success, the only proof needed to disprove centuries of oppression. Candace's tone wasn't hostile. It was smoother than that. It was polished, like a keynote speaker. Like someone not speaking to the room, but to a much larger audience that already agreed with her. She framed herself as the exception, and then tried to erase the rule. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise an eyebrow or shuffle in her chair. She waited for Candace to finish, then let the silence breathe for a heartbeat longer than expected. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't climb. It sank, low, grounded, and certain. "The problem," Jasmine said softly, "isn't that race is used too often. The problem is that it's ignored until it costs someone their life." That sentence didn't shout. It didn't sting, but it stopped everything. The moderator's hand froze halfway through adjusting his mic. One of the camera operators leaned just a bit closer into the viewfinder. The temperature in the room seemed to change, because what Jasmine offered wasn't a counterpoint, it was a mirror, and it made people look. "It's not about living in victimhood," she continued. "It's about being honest about the patterns that keep repeating. The sentencing gaps, the traffic stops, the profiling in classrooms, the missed job interviews. You don't get to dismiss that just because you beat the odds. That's not liberation. That's survival." Candace's smile thinned. She shifted her ankle slightly. It wasn't obvious, but for anyone watching closely, the edge had dulled. And Jasmine? She stayed exactly where she was, unbothered, unimpressed, not there to win, but there to reveal. She didn't bring slogans. She didn't need sound bites. What she brought was light, and tonight no one was getting out of the spotlight untouched. The conversation seemed to shift like sand underfoot. Candace, still clinging to her signature composure, had just finished another polished riff about personal responsibility. How progress comes not from protest, but from persistence. Not from policies, but from grit. The camera caught her mid-sentence, her smile unwavering, her hands gracefully articulating her points, as if she were on stage at a leadership summit. For a moment, it felt like every piece of the broadcast was moving according to the script. A polished debate between ideological opposites, sound bites primed for social media, with no real cost. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come for a debate. She had come for the truth. And truth doesn't play by the script. She waited for Candace to pause, not interrupting, not pressing, just watching. Then with a calmness that felt surgical, Jasmine reached into the side pocket of her binder and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. No dramatics, no raised voice, just precision. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, the gentle rustle of the page somehow louder than anything else in the room. "That's an interesting stance," she said, voice steady, eyes never leaving Candace. "Because last night I was reading a public record that tells a very different story, from 2007, I believe." She glanced briefly at the paper, then back up. "A discrimination complaint filed by you." For a split second, nothing moved. Not the moderator, not the panelists, not even the blinking studio lights that had flickered so reliably all night. It was the kind of silence that doesn't happen often on live television. Not the awkward kind, not the lost for words kind, but the kind that holds its breath because something just cracked through the surface. Candace blinked. Just once. Her lips parted in a controlled laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me?" she said, still smiling, though the edge of it wavered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jasmine didn't press. She didn't gloat. She simply kept her gaze fixed, her tone even. "Filed with the Stanford Board of Education," she continued. "You claim racial harassment in high school. Said the school failed to protect you. said you feared for your safety, and you didn't just file it. You want a settlement. Am I wrong? It was in that moment that the tension finally became visible. Candace's posture shifted ever so slightly, not enough to suggest panic, but just enough to betray calculation. Her hands, once fluid and expressive, now sat still on her lap. Her jaw clenched, just once, just faintly, but enough for the camera to catch. The moderator looked like he wanted to say something, to steer the conversation back to safety, but he didn't. Maybe he couldn't. The moment had already escaped him. Let's just keep things respectful, he said at last, eyes darting to the producer off camera. But Jasmine wasn't disrespecting anyone. Her tone didn't rise. Her words weren't accusations. They were facts. This is respectful, she replied coolly. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm asking how someone can spend years telling black kids that racism isn't real, when she herself once needed protection from it. The camera cut briefly to Candace. Her expression was blank now, somewhere between denial and recalibration. The audience, both in studio and at home, felt the shift. Not because someone had been exposed, but because a contradiction had been quietly, unavoidably revealed. The kind you can't unhear, the kind that lingers. And for the first time that night, the silence wasn't awkward. It was accountability. And it was Jasmine Crockett who brought it into the light. For a long moment, the studio floated in something between silence and breathlessness. Not a single word from Jasmine was spoken in anger. No raised tone, no theatrical pause. Just the quiet, unwavering delivery of a fact that hadn't been meant to surface. Not like this. Not now. And yet, there it was. A folded piece of paper had undone an entire narrative. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She held the moment in her palm, not to crush it, but to examine it. And maybe, just maybe, to set something straight. You were right to file that complaint, she said gently, the sheet of paper still in her hands, but the weight of it now transferred into her words. You were a kid, 17. You felt unsafe. You were targeted. You turned to the system for protection, and you got it. That wasn't weakness. That was justice. Her eyes were fixed on Candace, but her voice wasn't attacking her. It was reaching for the truth beneath the persona. Candace opened her mouth, perhaps to retort, perhaps to deny, but no words came. Then after a beat, she leaned forward, smile rehearsed but trembling at the edges. That's ancient history, she said with a forced laugh. It was a different time. I was a teenager. I've grown since then. She straightened her skirt, touched the mic clip to her lapel, not because it needed adjustment, but because it gave her something to do with her hands, something other than defend a contradiction she hadn't prepared for. But you were telling the truth, weren't you? Jasmine asked, quieter now. Not a trap, not a dig, just a door being held open. Candace paused, blinked, then nodded. Yes, I was, but that's not the point. It is the point, Jasmine said firmly, because the truth doesn't expire just because it's inconvenient now. Candace sat back, eyes narrowing slightly, voice firmer now. I'm not denying what happened to me. I'm saying we can't keep encouraging people to lean on that. It makes them weak. It teaches them to stay stuck. Her argument was well practiced, worn smooth like a stone turned over in the palm 1,000 times. It had worked before. Audiences had clapped. Social media had echoed. But tonight, the words didn't land the same way. Jasmine tilted her head, as if studying not just the answer, but the effort it took to say it. But you didn't get stuck, she said, her tone carrying something softer now. Not sympathy, but sincerity. You moved forward, not by denying what happened, but by naming it, by asking for help. And that was brave. So why pretend now that others don't deserve that same chance? Why tell them the very path that protected you is somehow a trap? The moderator said nothing. The other panelist, a former state senator from Arizona, shifted in his seat uncomfortably. But Jasmine didn't need backup. She wasn't performing. She was clarifying something that had been muddied for too long. That recognizing harm doesn't make someone broken, and asking for justice doesn't mean clinging to victimhood. You got justice, she said again, slower now. And you deserved it. But justice doesn't stop being real just because your platform changed. There was no anger in her voice, no personal attack, just the gentle, unflinching truth that growth isn't about burying the past. It's about honoring it, especially when others are still living what you barely survived. Before the panel, before the lights, before the rhetoric and the microphones and the brand, there was a hallway, white linoleum, fluorescent buzz, lockers slamming in the distance, too loud, too sharp. The kind of sound that made your heart tighten, not because it was violent, but because it had followed something that was. She was 17. Her backpack hung low, one strap torn at the edge. She walked faster than she needed to, not because she was late to class, but because she didn't want to pass the gym doors again. That's where they waited, where the whispers always came louder when she passed, where the word, that word, had been scratched into her locker with a key. And that day, it hadn't just been written. It had been shouted, she told her teacher. At first, he looked confused, as if maybe she'd misheard. Then he asked if she wanted to go to the nurse. She said no. She just wanted someone to make it stop. The next day, it got worse. Her tires were slashed. Her name, the one she was proud of, the one her grandmother chose, had been scrawled on the pavement in chalk, with slurs underneath. She didn't cry at school. She waited until her mother picked her up, until they sat in the driveway, and the silence between them grew too thick to breathe through. That's when the tears came, angry, hot, ashamed. Not because she was weak, but because she'd spent too long pretending she wasn't scared. It was her mother who told her to write it down. Everything, every word. Every time she felt her stomach drop before stepping into the cafeteria. Every time a teacher looked away. Every time a hallway got too quiet the moment she stepped into it. Her mother said, "Put it on paper, because the world won't believe you unless you do." So she did, carefully, reluctantly, but completely, and she filed the complaint. Not because she wanted to cause trouble, but because she wanted to breathe again without checking over her shoulder. The board called it an incident. They called it unfortunate. But eventually, slowly, quietly, things started to shift. She was moved out of a class. The school held a vague assembly about respect and inclusion. And then weeks later, her family received a letter, a settlement. She had been right to speak, and the system for once had listened. It didn't erase the fear, but it acknowledged it. And for that, she felt, for the first time in months, like she mattered. That 17-year-old didn't know what she would become. She didn't know she would grow into someone who filled auditoriums, who sparked headlines, who spoke in absolutes about personal strength and the myth of victimhood. All she knew then was that she had been afraid, that she had felt invisible, that the system she would one day call exaggerated had once been the only thing standing between her and silence. And maybe if she could have seen the woman she would become, the one sitting across from Jasmine Crockett, denying that same system to millions of others, maybe she would have asked, why are we pretending we never bled? The silence that followed the memory of 17-year-old Candace was thick but brief. Candace knew the moment was slipping, and Candace Owens didn't let moments slip. So she did what she had done so many times before. She pivoted to numbers. Her voice regained its familiar cadence, that precise rhythm she used when she needed to reestablish control. "Let's talk facts," she said, voice firmer, louder. "Black Americans make up just 13% of the population, yet they're responsible for over 50% of violent crime. That's not an opinion. That's FBI data. Cold, hard. Truth." She leaned back slightly, hands folded, chin lifted, like someone confident they just nailed the final slide in a PowerPoint presentation. It was a tactic she'd used in speeches, podcasts, interviews, weaponizing numbers like shields, daring opponents to argue against math. She knew most people wouldn't. The numbers, after all, were real, but what she never accounted for was someone who understood how they were gathered. Someone like Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't even turn her head right away. When she finally did, she moved slowly, deliberately, like a professor preparing to correct a half-finished thesis. "Are you seriously doing that right now?" she asked, her voice still calm, but touched with something sharper now. Not anger, but steel. Throwing out cherry-picked crime data like it's gospel? She let the question hang, then added, "It's not cherry-picked," Candace replied. Her voice clipped. "It's real." "It's real," Jasmine repeated, "but it's not complete, because those numbers don't account for how the system decides what gets counted in the first place." She leaned forward, not to dominate, but to narrow the distance between data and reality. Policing isn't neutral. Surveillance isn't equal. You know how many crimes go unreported in affluent white suburbs because they're handled quietly, without arrests, without paperwork? But every fight in a poor black neighborhood becomes an incident. Every stop becomes a report. Every child becomes a statistic. There was no anger in her voice, just truth, compact and undeniable. Candace's expression froze just for a second. She tried to regroup. "You can't excuse violence just because of the zip code it happens in." Jasmine shook her head slightly. "I'm not excusing anything. I'm explaining why numbers alone can't explain everything. And you know that." Her voice lowered again, just a degree. "You lived it, remember? When you were harassed, no one looked at the stats first. They looked at you, scared, alone, asking to be believed." That sentence landed like a slow echo, the kind that travels through the body before the mind catches up. The moderator didn't interrupt. Neither did the other panelists. The camera panned slowly across the two women, one locked in defense, the other steady in truth. Jasmine's voice never rose. She didn't lean on drama. She leaned on memory, context, and lived experience. The one thing numbers could never fully hold. "This isn't a debate," she said finally, her tone final but not finalizing. "It's a reckoning. And reckoning doesn't come from statistics. It comes from listening to what the numbers were never designed to capture." And just like that, the conversation changed again. Because the numbers might have been clean, but the system behind them wasn't. And Jasmine, she was here to read what had been written in between the lines, and to make sure the nation heard it too. Candace tried again. Her voice had lost some of its sparkle, but she pushed forward with familiar urgency. "So what are you saying?" she snapped, a hint of frustration creeping into the edges of her tone. "That we shouldn't look at violent crime? That it's all just a misunderstanding? Come on, Congresswoman. We can't fix anything if we're too scared to admit where the problems are." Jasmine didn't blink. Her gaze remained steady, her tone unchanged. She didn't match Candace's rising energy. She redirected it. "No one's scared to admit there are problems," she replied. "We live with those problems every day. What we're not going to do is pretend the system that records those problems isn't part of the problem itself." Candace leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "That sounds like an excuse." That was the moment. The moment Jasmine sat back ever so slightly, spine still straight, eyes calm, voice a degree cooler but more powerful than anything she'd said before. "You," she said slowly, "of all people, should know the system isn't neutral." The sentence didn't hit like a punch. It landed like a truth that had been waiting too long to be said. One of the camera operators visibly flinched, his hand tightening slightly on the focus ring. The moderator, whose job until now had been to maintain structure, leaned back in his seat, his posture collapsing just enough to suggest he realized structure had left the building. For a brief second, even the light on Candace's face seemed to shift. Her rhythm faltered. Not by much, but enough. Jasmine didn't stop. "You know what it feels like to walk into a building and feel the temperature drop just because of the color of your skin? You know what it's like to report something and not be believed until it's too big to ignore. You know what it's like to fear silence more than noise. You knew all of that when you were 17. So don't sit here and tell people who are still living that reality that it's all in their heads." Candace exhaled sharply, the kind of exhale that's meant to reset the conversation, but instead reveals how hard you're working to hold it together. "That was a different time," she insisted, almost pleading with the past to stay buried. "I didn't let it define me." "No," Jasmine answered gently. "You let it protect you. You let it validate you. You let it become the reason someone finally listened. And then you walked away from it like it never happened, while others are still walking through the same fire, barefoot, with no one there to witness. The studio wasn't silent. It was reverent, not in awe, but in recognition. Jasmine's words didn't command attention by volume. They commanded it by depth. Even the other panelists, silent until now, looked down as if he'd suddenly remembered something he wished he hadn't. Candace tried to recover. "I'm just saying we need to stop encouraging people to lean on victimhood." But Jasmine interrupted, softly but clearly. "We're not encouraging victimhood. We're demanding visibility. That's not the same thing. And if you're still calling that weakness, then maybe you've forgotten what being invisible felt like." It was subtle, but final, like a door closing. Not slammed, just firmly shut. Candace leaned back, her silence this time not measured, but lost. Her rhythm had broken. And Jasmine's? Jasmine had only just begun to find hers. Candace sat in the silence that followed Jasmine's words, eyes locked forward but not quite focused. For a split second, the usual sharpness in her expression gave way to something else. A flicker, brief and almost imperceptible, but real. Vulnerability. It came and went like a breeze through a closed room, but it was enough. Enough to suggest that something inside her recognized the truth, even if she couldn't afford to acknowledge it out loud. She shifted in her seat, crossed her legs the other way, adjusted her lapel. The moves were small, but the energy had changed. Jasmine saw it, and instead of pressing the advantage, instead of twisting the moment into a weapon, she did something Candace didn't expect. She let the pause settle, and then she said softly, "I'm not trying to make you feel small." Her tone was so even, so stripped of hostility, that it momentarily disarmed the tension in the room. "I'm reminding you, you're bigger than this." The words didn't sting, they didn't wound, but they cut, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. They landed not like judgment, but like a mirror being held up, quiet and patient. For the first time all night, Candace didn't have a retort at the ready. Her mouth opened slightly but closed again. Her hands stayed still. Even the moderator, who had been looking for a window to regain control of the panel, held back. He knew, as everyone in the room now did, that this was no longer just a televised discussion. It was something else, something quieter, but far more consequential. "You've been through what so many are still going through," Jasmine continued. "You know that fear, that tightening in your chest when authority doesn't feel safe. You know the shame of being dismissed, the ache of wanting someone to believe you, not because you're weak, but because you're human. So why tell others to pretend it doesn't matter? Why act like naming it is the same as being consumed by it?" The audience, whether in the studio or on couches across America, was holding its collective breath. Not because this was dramatic, but because it was deeply, uncomfortably honest. There was no yelling, no interrupting, no headline-grabbing line. Just two women, one searching for her footing, the other refusing to turn her insight into ammunition. Candace finally broke the stillness, but her voice was different now, lower, tighter. "You think I'm a traitor," she said, not looking directly at Jasmine. "You think I've turned my back on my community because I don't walk around angry." Jasmine didn't hesitate. I think you're dishonest," she said evenly. "And there's a difference." The moment didn't explode. It unfolded. Slowly. Intimately. You're allowed to grow. You're allowed to change your mind. But what you're not allowed to do is rewrite history to make yourself look strong while telling others their pain is a weakness. In living rooms across the country, viewers sat with that discomfort. Some nodded, some frowned, some looked away, not because they disagreed, but because they remembered a moment when they, too, had buried their own hurt to appear strong. Jasmine wasn't just speaking to Candace anymore. She was speaking to everyone who had been told to move on, to get over it, to stop making it about race. "I'm not here to tear you down," Jasmine said at last, her voice steady but full. "I'm here because the people watching deserve the whole truth, not just the part that fits the brand." And in that moment, no one could argue she hadn't delivered it. There was a moment, maybe a second, maybe less, when everything seemed to pause. Not just in the studio, but in the space between the cameras and the audience. between the words and the weight they carried. Candace had just tried, once more, to steer the conversation back into safer waters. "I didn't get here by crying for sympathy," she said, voice clipped, hands now clenched together in her lap. "I got here by refusing to be a victim. That's what I teach people, to stop complaining and start climbing." It was a familiar close, something she'd said 100 times before, but this time, it didn't land with confidence. It landed like a script being read in the wrong scene. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't lean in, didn't adjust her mic, didn't shift in her seat. She simply turned her eyes toward Candace, and with a voice that was neither soft nor loud, but utterly unshakable, she spoke the sentence that would echo far beyond the studio. "You can't rewrite history just because the cameras are on." It was not delivered like a punchline. There was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just truth, flat, honest, and immovable, like a stone placed gently in the center of the table. And yet it changed everything. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. The moderator blinked, visibly unsure whether to move forward or stay still. Candace opened her mouth, perhaps to respond, perhaps to redirect, but nothing came. For the first time in the segment, her expression cracked. Not into anger, but into something closer to confusion. Her armor had been built for confrontation, not for clarity. In the control room, a producer mouthed the word "clip" before the sentence had even finished echoing through the studio. Another was already signaling to isolate the feed, to tag the timestamp. They knew what had just happened. The internet would know too, within seconds. On screen, Candace shifted in her chair, one heel tapping anxiously against the base of the table. She reached again for her lapel mic, though it was already secure. A reflex now. Something to do with her hands while she scrambled for control. And Jasmine? She exhaled, not in exhaustion, but in completion. She didn't lean back. She didn't close her eyes. She just rested in the silence that followed, like someone who had carried a weight for too long and had finally set it down. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her breath was even. She looked neither triumphant nor smug. She simply looked finished. Because that one sentence had done what a dozen facts and arguments could not. It had pierced the performance. Online, the ignition was instant. Within moments, the raw studio feed began trending. Someone in the audience had already tweeted the quote with the caption, "She didn't flinch." Journalists, activists, teachers, even apolitical accounts. They all began reposting the clip before the segment could even reach its first commercial break. The quote appeared on graphics, over stills and threads. Some just typed the line without commentary, as if it didn't need one. And it didn't, because everyone who heard it understood, whether they agreed or not, that something had been laid bare. Candace fidgeted. Jasmine rested. One wrestled with the moment. The other became it. And as the moderator glanced toward the control booth, clearly unsure whether to cut or continue, it no longer mattered. The moment had already left the room. It was now in phones, on feeds, in group chats, and in living rooms where people were slowly realizing that they'd just witnessed a line they wouldn't forget. A sentence that didn't just silence a room, it broke the illusion. Jasmine hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had only needed to raise the truth. Backstage, the quiet was almost eerie. The lights were softer now, the stage far behind, but the energy still pulsed in the walls. In the green room, the silence was no longer professional, it was personal. Candace Owens paced in tight, uneven circles, the click of her heels on the tiled floor growing sharper with each step. Her assistant stood nearby, phone in hand, whispering updates she clearly wasn't ready to hear. "It's already on Twitter," the assistant said hesitantly. "They clipped it. The line. It's everywhere." Candace didn't respond. She adjusted her jacket for the third time, then pulled it off completely and tossed it over the back of a chair. Her phone buzzed on the table, but she ignored it. She was replaying the moment, over and over, the way someone replays a fall they didn't see coming. Just one sentence. That's all it had taken. Meanwhile, across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. Her blazer was unbuttoned now, but otherwise she hadn't moved. Her phone sat on the table, face down, vibrating quietly every few seconds. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to. She already knew the world outside that room had picked up what she laid down, knew that something had shifted, not in her favor, that wasn't what she was after, but toward the truth. She breathed in slowly, then exhaled without urgency. No one spoke to her. Not yet. There was nothing to say. The moment had spoken for itself. Online, the explosion was immediate and uncontainable. The clip circulated before the show even cut to commercial. A producer's assistant had leaked the raw angle. No edits, no commentary. Just that single line delivered with a calm that cut deeper than rage ever could. You can't rewrite history just because the cameras are on. The quote trended within minutes, not just on Twitter, but on TikTok, Instagram, even LinkedIn. Each platform finding its own way to echo what so many had been waiting to hear. Screenshots with subtitles, reaction videos with teachers nodding in silence. Journalists began drafting threads not about the debate, but about what had just happened to the national conversation. In barbershops, classrooms, ER lounges, and corner stores, people stopped what they were doing to replay it, again and again. A nurse in Detroit pulled it up on her break and texted it to her daughter with the message, "She said what I couldn't find the words for." A substitute teacher in Atlanta showed it to a class of 11th graders during homeroom. They watched in silence, then asked her to play it again. In a small apartment in Oakland, a grandmother leaned over her kitchen table, tears in her eyes, whispering to no one in particular, "She said it for us." Because it wasn't just about Candace Owens. It wasn't even just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about years, decades, being told that pain was imaginary, that struggle was exaggerated, that silence was more polite than truth. It was about every time someone changed their name on a resume, or stayed quiet during a traffic stop, or swallowed their story because they didn't want to sound angry. Jasmine hadn't shouted for them. She hadn't pleaded. She had simply held their reality like something sacred. And in doing so, she reminded the country that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in a sentence so still, it shakes the ground beneath it. Long before the stage lights and the trending clips, Jasmine Crockett had already been standing in rooms no one was filming. Rooms without makeup artists, without producers signaling from the shadows. They were small, drafty, sometimes half empty. Town halls where the chairs creaked and the microphone cut out halfway through. Courtrooms that smelled of paper and worry. School basements turned into community centers, their floors scuffed from 100 previous meetings that never made the news. She had sat in those rooms not as a guest, not as a savior, but as a witness. And sometimes being a witness was the heaviest role of all. There was the mother in Shreveport, a single bag of groceries in her cart, 3 children orbiting her like restless satellites when the security guard began following her. Nothing was said, not at first, but it was in the glances, the tightening of his posture, the way he hovered a little too long near the baby formula aisle. When she checked out, they asked to see her receipt, not once but twice, and she handed it over with shaking hands because her children were watching. She'd come to a town hall later that week, not to complain, but to ask, "How do I teach my baby's dignity when mine keeps getting taken?" Then there was the teacher in Amarillo, a woman who had spent 20 years in public education, who'd stopped class once to confront a student who used a racial slur. The administration told her afterward, "We understand your concern, but try not to make it about race next time. Keep the classroom focused on learning," as if her students could learn anything while pretending some of them weren't bleeding under the surface. She didn't want attention. She didn't want an apology. She wanted to know if anyone in leadership had ever felt that same burn in their chest when silence was louder than slurs. Jasmine remembered all of them. She didn't keep files or folders. She carried them in the tone of her voice, in the silence between her sentences, in the way she stood behind a podium as if she were never alone. Because in truth, she wasn't. She was always speaking for someone else, the man too tired from his second shift to write his story down, the teenager who didn't know how to name what they were feeling, the grandmother who had told the same story for 40 years and was still waiting for someone to believe her. That's why when she spoke that night on national television, it wasn't about outperforming anyone. It was about presence, not for herself, but for those who had never been handed a mic. She didn't need applause. She needed accuracy. She didn't crave headlines. She craved repair. Every sentence she spoke was stitched with the threads of the unheard. That was the real reason she didn't flinch when the moment came. She wasn't standing there alone. She was standing for thousands, and that made her unshakable. The hours that followed the broadcast were a blur of headlines, alerts, reposts, and rapid-fire commentary. Candace Owens moved quickly, as she always did. Before the credits finished rolling, she had already taken to social media with a measured blend of deflection and indignation. Her tweets were sharp, clipped, carefully crafted to reinforce her brand. A woman under attack by the left for daring to speak the real truth. Funny how speaking facts is now considered offensive, she wrote. Then a follow-up. I lived through racism. I overcame it. That's strength. But apparently telling others they can too is now controversial. Within 2 hours, she had recorded a 10-minute podcast episode from her hotel suite. The title, Performance, Politics, and the Victimhood Industry. Her tone was familiar, confident, brisk, wounded, but unyielding. She described the debate as a coordinated ambush, the show as staged, and Jasmine as clearly more interested in viral moments than in real policy. The comments flooded in. Her base was active, vocal, reaffirming, but the enthusiasm was tempered. The likes came slower. The applause sounded distant, as if even her most loyal followers sensed something had shifted. Not because of what she said, but because of what she couldn't unsay. Jasmine, meanwhile, posted nothing for hours. She didn't quote herself. She didn't share the clip. She didn't retweet the praise that was already pouring in from lawmakers, educators, and community organizers across the country. Her silence was not absence. It was restraint. While the internet buzzed, she remained still. And then sometime near midnight, her account finally updated. It was a photo, a simple one. Jasmine seated in the studio chair, her hands folded in her lap, gaze steady, her face neither smiling nor stern. Just present. Beneath it, 4 words. No hashtags, no links, no emojis. Hold your truth steady. That was it. No defense, no elaboration. Just a sentence that felt less like a caption and more like a philosophy. While Candace tried to reclaim the narrative with volume, Jasmine reclaimed it with presence. One post, quiet, clear, unshakable, stood taller than a dozen rebuttals. Because where Candace sought to reframe the moment, Jasmine didn't need to. The moment had already spoken, and she had no interest in drowning it out. Commentators quickly picked up on the contrast. A veteran journalist tweeted, Owens dropped a podcast, Crockett dropped a sentence. Guess which one stuck? A professor from Howard wrote, volume doesn't equal power. Candace brought the noise. Jasmine brought the weight. But it wasn't just pundits. The sentiment spread quietly across communities that knew what it meant to speak carefully, to live under scrutiny, to be told that clarity without aggression isn't strength. Jasmine's restraint didn't read as silence. It read as control. The kind of control earned by people who have had to carry truths others denied. Intent versus impact. Candace's intent was to stay in control. Jasmine's impact was that she no longer needed to. One woman tried to direct the conversation. The other let the conversation direct itself. By rooting it in truth so firm, it needed no defense. That's why Jasmine's words stuck. Because they weren't part of a strategy. They were the echo of something older, deeper, and shared. And in a world full of shouting, there is something undeniably powerful about someone who simply refuses to be shaken. In a modest kitchen on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, the light above the dining table flickered faintly as an old laptop played the clip for the 3rd time. A father, sleeves rolled up from washing dishes, leaned on the counter, arms crossed, watching it with his teenage daughter sitting at the table. She had her elbows on the surface, chin in her hands, eyes wide, not scrolling, not distracted, just listening. Jasmine's voice played again, steady as ever. You can't rewrite history just because the cameras are on. The father paused the video and turned to his daughter. You see that? He said, not raising his voice, just speaking like he wanted her to remember. That's how you defend yourself without lowering yourself. His daughter didn't respond right away, just nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the frozen frame of Jasmine, mid-sentence, glowing in the laptop light. She hadn't seen anything like it before. Not a woman shouting to be heard, but one speaking so clearly that the world had no choice but to listen. Hundreds of miles south in Little Rock, Arkansas, a social studies teacher stood in front of a class of 11th graders, remote in hand, clip queued up on the projector. The class had just finished a unit on civil discourse in modern media, and she had planned to show an excerpt from a state legislative session. But that morning she'd seen the Jasmine clip, and everything changed. She hit play. The students were talkative at first, whispering, some scrolling their phones. But by the time Jasmine calmly stated, "You were right to ask for help," the room had gone quiet. At the end, one student in the back, a boy who rarely raised his hand, asked, "Can you send that to me?" The teacher smiled. She didn't need to explain what had just happened. The clip had done the teaching. Later that afternoon, she wrote in her lesson journal, "We talk about courage like it needs volume." Today they saw it doesn't. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a woman in her 60s sat alone on the Route 210 bus heading downtown. She wore a faded denim jacket, her hair tucked into a head wrap, and her phone resting face up on her knee. She watched the clip, earbuds in, her expression unreadable. Until the end, when Jasmine turned to the camera and said, "Hold your truth steady." The woman nodded, almost imperceptibly. She looked out the window for a long moment, then removed one earbud and turned to the stranger seated next to her. "You know what got me?" she said, eyes shining but fierce. "She didn't even yell. She didn't have to." The other passenger nodded, even though they hadn't seen the clip. Sometimes the way someone says something is enough to tell you what it meant. The reaction wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In kitchens, classrooms, break rooms, and city buses, people across the country were replaying that moment. Not because it was flashy, but because it felt familiar. It was the way a mother talks when she's tired of being dismissed. The way a teacher leans in when she knows her students have never heard someone stand that still in their truth. The way a stranger on a bus knows the story without needing all the words. Jasmine hadn't gone viral because she was sensational. She had gone viral because she had spoken in a tone the nation recognized. The quiet, certain sound of someone refusing to be erased. It didn't happen all at once. The shift was slow, not dramatic like a storm, but subtle like a change in temperature you don't notice until you're already shivering. In comment sections and private group chats, on message boards and podcasts that once echoed Candace Owens' voice like gospel, something quieter began to surface. Uncertainty, a hesitation, a pause where there once would have been applause. "I've followed her for years," one commenter wrote on a conservative blog thread, "but I've never seen her look like that before. I don't know. Something felt off." Another admitted more bluntly, "I believed her until now." They weren't angry. Not yet. Not defensive either. What they were, perhaps for the first time, was reflective. Jasmine hadn't insulted Candace. She hadn't dismantled her with snark or cornered her with theatrics. She had simply shown her the mirror, and when the reflection came back cracked, people noticed. Because there's a difference between being challenged and being exposed. A challenge invites debate. Exposure leaves silence. And what viewers saw in that studio wasn't a collapse, but a revelation. Not a failure, but a fracture. For years, Candace had spoken with the confidence of someone who had all the answers. Her certainty was part of her appeal. She didn't just speak, she declared. She didn't just argue, she performed. And for those who had longed for a voice that cut through the noise, her boldness had felt like clarity. But Jasmine showed them something else. What real clarity sounds like when it doesn't need to shout. What strength looks like when it doesn't lean on confrontation to exist. In a podcast discussion days later, a former supporter phrased it best: "Dignity feels different when it's real." "I used to think Candace was the only one being honest. Now I think maybe she just got really good at performing honesty." The panel went quiet after that, not because they disagreed, but because they understood. What Jasmine had done wasn't win an argument. She had reminded people what authenticity feels like when it isn't rehearsed. She had stripped away the spectacle without ever raising her voice. That's what unsettled people. Not just what was said, but how it was said. Calmly, without ego, without spinning. She wasn't trying to go viral, and yet that very absence of performance made her words ring louder. Jasmine didn't come to destroy Candace. She came to preserve something bigger. The truth, yes, but also the memory of what it feels like to tell it. And that memory stirred something uncomfortable in those who had once cheered for Owens without question. They weren't rushing to disavow her, but they weren't rushing to defend her either. And in that space, that quiet, unfamiliar pause, something powerful happened. People looked inward. They watched the clip again, and this time, not for the drama, but for the details. The way Candace's smile faltered, the way Jasmine's never needed to harden, the way one tried to steer the narrative while the other simply let it stand on its own. Jasmine hadn't asked anyone to choose sides. She hadn't demanded loyalty or canceled anyone. She'd only asked a question, handed someone their own words, and waited. And in that waiting, 1,000 silent mirror moments unfolded across the country. Quiet reckonings, not with politics, but with self. It didn't go viral because it was dramatic. It went viral because it was precise. People didn't rewind the clip to laugh or cheer or gawk. They replayed it because something in it rang so true, it felt like recognition. And the more they watched it, the more they understood. This wasn't a gotcha moment. It was accountability. Jasmine Crockett didn't expose Candace Owens. She simply stopped allowing the gap between what was said and what had been lived to go unaddressed. And in doing so, she revealed something deeper. That truth doesn't need to be performed. It only needs to be held steady. Candace had walked onto that stage armed with data, poise, and a brand that had been meticulously built over years. The self-made woman who defied victimhood, who rejected what she called the culture of complaint. She had spoken those lines so many times they came out as reflex. But reflex doesn't hold when real memory walks into the room. Jasmine didn't come with better stats or louder sound bites. She came with something older, heavier, and harder to fake: lived truth. She stood on it like stone, and when Candace tried to push against it, she didn't budge. That's what people saw, and that's why it hit so hard. Because in an era where spin is constant and platforms are built on performance, what Jasmine did felt disarmingly simple. She didn't try to corner Candace. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry. She asked a question, held up a documented fact, and let the contradiction breathe in full view. And when Candace reached for her usual tools, the pivot, the statistics, the sarcasm, they didn't land. Not because they weren't clever, but because they didn't match the weight of the moment. Her words floated. Jasmine's stayed grounded. That contrast between spinning and staying still is what made the exchange feel different. Viewers have grown used to political theater, the shouting, the interruptions, the zingers meant to go viral. But this wasn't that. This wasn't performance, it was presence. Jasmine didn't speak to win, she spoke to center. Her tone said, "I'm not here to embarrass you, I'm here to remind you." And in that act of remembrance, she reminded everyone watching that strength doesn't come from dominating a room. It comes from anchoring it. And Candace, for all her experience, for all her fluency in high-stakes debates, she had nothing to anchor to, not in that moment. Because her brand had been built on moving the conversation, on always being the one to control the lens. But Jasmine held up a mirror. And the difference between holding a mic and holding a mirror is this: one broadcasts your voice, the other reflects your truth, whether you're ready for it or not. People felt it in their bodies before they processed it in their minds. That's why the clip didn't just trend, it resonated. It lingered. It got sent from parent to child, from teacher to student, not because it was flashy, but because it was familiar. Jasmine gave voice to a kind of courage many people carry silently. The courage to stay grounded when others spin. The courage to name what's real even when it's inconvenient. The courage to remember when forgetting is easier. And that's why it hit so hard. Not because it was new, but because it finally gave shape to something millions had already lived, and were waiting for someone to finally say out loud. The cameras were off now. The studio lights replaced by the fluorescent hum of congressional hearing rooms, by long wooden desks and stacks of draft legislation. Back in Washington, the noise had quieted, but Jasmine Crockett hadn't. She hadn't needed to trend to feel effective. She didn't return to Capitol Hill with a victory lap. She returned with her folder, her notes, and that same quiet steadiness that had held a room full of lights and tension just days before. To her, the moment on television hadn't changed her. It had simply revealed what she had been doing all along. In hearing rooms lined with bored interns, impatient lobbyists, and elected officials flipping through prepared statements, Jasmine listened, fully, not just to the words spoken into the microphone, but to the tone, the hesitation, the buried truth behind statistics and summaries. When she asked a question, it wasn't for show. It was because someone back home had asked her the same question months ago and still hadn't received an answer. When she pressed a witness, it wasn't for spectacle. It was for clarity, because clarity had become her currency. She sat through budget negotiations, housing reform roundtables, and judiciary subcommittees with the same poise she had shown on that stage. When others postured, she listened. When others spun, she recalibrated. And when the time came to speak, she didn't adjust her voice. She adjusted the room. Her presence was less like a spotlight and more like a compass, quiet but impossible to ignore. She had learned something vital. Real influence doesn't always need amplification. It needs alignment. Between values and action, between words and history. In Dallas, she hosted a town hall 3 weeks after the panel aired. The chairs were plastic, the floor scuffed, and the mic squeaked twice before someone fixed it with a piece of tape. But Jasmine spoke with the same conviction she had on national television. She greeted everyone by name, asked about their families, remembered which grandmother had lost housing last winter, and which teen had just made honor roll. There were no lights, no producers, no trending hashtags, just people who came because they knew she would be there, not for herself, but for them. When someone asked her about that night, the moment, the quote, the aftermath, she paused. That wasn't a performance, she said. It was policy in disguise. She explained that the story behind that paper she unfolded on air, the old complaint, wasn't just about one contradiction. It was about how often we bury our own truth to be palatable, to be accepted, to avoid shaking rooms we were never invited to fill in the first place. That's why I bring the stories with me, she added, into every meeting, into every markup session. Not just the facts, but the lived facts, because you can't legislate what you won't name. Back in Congress, she co-sponsored a bill to increase federal protections for students facing racial harassment in schools. She pushed for restorative justice funding in underserved districts, citing both data and testimony from community members. Her arguments weren't fiery, but grounded. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but immovable. She had learned, long before the panel, long before the viral clip, that power rooted in truth doesn't need to rise above the noise. It simply needs to outlast it. And Jasmine Crockett had no intention of fading just because the cameras had. Before the lights, before the trending clips, before she ever stepped into a studio with national broadcast reach, Jasmine Crockett stood in a room with 6 folding chairs, a water-stained ceiling tile, and one faulty mic duct taped to a shaky podium. It was a Tuesday night in a forgotten wing of a public library, the kind of room more used to PTA meetings and neighborhood watch updates than political discourse. The floor smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. The fluorescent lights buzzed. No cameras, no staffers, just 6 people who came because a flyer had been posted on a corkboard near the checkout desk, promising a discussion on community justice. She was nervous, but not unsure. Nervous because she hadn't yet built the armor that public life would later require, but never unsure about why she was there. Her notes were handwritten, not printed. Her shoes were scuffed from walking door to door the night before, campaigning without signs, without slogans, just conversation. She wore a black blazer that didn't quite fit at the shoulders and a necklace her aunt had given her to help you look official. The mic cut out on her third sentence. She paused. Someone in the second row, A woman with thick glasses and a notepad said, "We can hear you just fine." And so Jasmine kept going. She raised her voice not to shout, but to carry. She slowed her pace not for drama, but so no one missed a word. She spoke of housing displacement, of school discipline disparities, of why a conviction record shouldn't mean a lifetime sentence to invisibility. Her voice didn't tremble. It filled the room as if there were 60 people, not 6. Because for Jasmine, it was never about who showed up. It was about who might one day need to know that someone had spoken. She knew the odds were long. She knew the systems were slow. But she also knew how many people had been waiting for someone to just say it, plainly without talking down, without talking past. Just say it. One man in the back had his arms crossed the entire time. Didn't ask a question, didn't applaud. But as he left, he paused in the doorway and said, "You're gonna do something." Don't know what, but something. She never forgot that. Not because it was praise, but because it was recognition. Even then, even in that tiny room, she wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to speak clearly enough that the right people would hear her, even if they didn't say so out loud. Years later, when the cameras finally arrived, when the stages grew and the rooms filled, her cadence stayed the same. Still deliberate, still grounded, still speaking like it mattered, not because it was recorded, but because it was true. That voice, the one people now called unshakable or measured, had been shaped not in headlines but in library rooms, church basements, court waiting areas. And that voice hadn't changed. Only the stage had. Because from the very beginning, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak to be seen. She spoke so others could feel heard. In a quiet classroom on the edge of Flagstaff, Arizona, the hum of a ceiling fan mixed with the final seconds of a paused video. On the screen, Jasmine Crockett sat frozen in mid-sentence, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes clear, expression unbothered. Across from her, Candace Owens looked downward. Mid-reaction, the faint tension in her jaw captured in pixelated stillness. The debate coach, Ms. Leland, held the remote loosely in one hand, her thumb resting just above the play button, though she didn't press it. Instead, she turned to her group of seniors, a mix of eager future law students, soft-spoken analysts, and a few who'd joined debate just to get out of gym. They were all quiet now. She didn't give them a lecture. She didn't draw a diagram on the whiteboard. She asked a single question. "Which woman," she said, "do you want to be when it's your turn to speak?" The room stayed silent for a moment longer. Some students glanced at the screen. Others looked down. A few shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Not because the question was hard, but because it was too easy. And they knew it. Miss Leland waited. She had taught for 21 years, and she knew when a question needed space to land. She looked around the room, catching each pair of eyes without rushing anyone. "Not who made you feel smarter," she added. "Not who you agreed with. I'm asking who showed you something worth becoming." That's when the hands started to rise. Not all at once, not in a wave, but slowly, steadily. One by one, students offered their answers, and none of them chose volume. None of them pointed to the woman who had spoken louder, moved faster, thrown out sharper data. They talked about presence, about dignity, about control that didn't need to be announced. One girl said, "She didn't try to win. She just didn't move." A boy near the window said, "She didn't raise her voice, and I still couldn't stop listening." Another student, quiet all semester, added, "She made the other person look small without even trying. And then she said she wasn't trying to make her feel small." That hit me. The coach let the responses roll, scribbling none of it on the board, capturing all of it in silence. This, she knew, was what education was meant to be. Not the absorption of data, but the confrontation of values. Jasmine Crockett, in that pause frame, had become a case study not in debate tactics, but in human conduct. The question wasn't about political affiliation anymore. It wasn't even about race, though that history beat beneath every word. It was about what it means to speak from truth and what it costs to abandon it. After the bell rang and the students filed out, two lingered behind to ask if they could show the clip to their parents. One said, My mom's always telling me not to speak up in class when it's about race, but I want her to see that it's possible to say it without being loud. Ms. Leland nodded, not offering advice, just placing the remote on her desk and saying, "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not flinch." She looked back at the pause screen, where Jasmine still sat, quiet, composed, unwavering. And she knew without doubt that today's lesson would outlive the school year. Because every generation will have a moment when the mic is handed to them. And what matters most is what they choose to do with it. Some lessons arrive dressed in volume, shouted across stages, backed by applause, reinforced by numbers. But others slip in softly, not to startle, but to stay. Jasmine Crockett's lesson was the second kind. It didn't flash or explode. It didn't chase the spotlight. It simply stood where it belonged, unmoved, unshaken, undeniable. And perhaps that's why it lingered. Because long after the debate ended, after the trending tags quieted, and after the panels moved on to newer headlines, people still came back to that moment. Not because of the words alone, but because of how she carried them. She taught us that you don't have to match their tone, that calm isn't weakness, it's strategy, that when someone comes at you with provocation, deflection, or performance, you can meet them with something rarer: clarity. Jasmine didn't raise her voice to meet the tempo of her opponent. She lowered the room to meet the truth. And in doing so, she reminded us that you don't need to echo the noise to be heard through it. You just have to say something real and hold it steady. What made her voice powerful wasn't its volume, but its roots. Every sentence she spoke that night was anchored in something deeper than data: lived experience, collective memory, and a refusal to let history be edited for comfort. That's where her dignity came from. And dignity, as it turned out, was louder than applause. While others tried to impress, she chose to resonate. She didn't need to convince people she was right. She needed to remind them what right sounded like. She didn't insult Candace. She didn't belittle her. She didn't even deny the idea of growth. What she denied, with precision, was the rewriting of personal truth to serve a public image. That's what accountability looks like. Not a takedown, not a spectacle, just a refusal to pretend. Jasmine's greatest strength wasn't in pointing fingers, but in holding a mirror. And when the reflection cracked, she didn't gloat. She stayed still and let the truth do the work. For too long, accountability has been misunderstood as a personal attack, something to be avoided, deflected, or shouted over. But Jasmine reminded us that accountability isn't personal. It's necessary, not because it makes someone look bad, but because it makes the rest of us feel seen. She didn't hold Candace to a higher standard than anyone else. She simply asked her to honor the standard she once needed for herself. And in doing that, she honored all of us who've been told to move on when the wound is still fresh. People watched her and remembered someone, maybe a teacher, a parent, a community elder, who taught them that strength isn't loud and silence isn't the absence of power. It's sometimes where the power begins. Jasmine didn't teach with force. She taught with foundation, and that foundation is what allowed so many to recognize her as not just a politician, but a vessel for stories too often dismissed, for truths too often reshaped, and for futures too often written without our input. What Jasmine taught us can't be reduced to a headline. It can't be clipped, remixed, or spun, because what she taught wasn't a moment. It was a model for how to speak, how to stand, and how to refuse to be pulled out of position by anyone else's performance. And in a world trained to reward the loudest, she reminded us of something much more valuable: how to be still and still be heard. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She planted a seed. In the middle of a room built for performance, where sound bites are currency and conflict is the headline, she chose something quieter and far more disruptive. She chose to tell the truth without decoration. She didn't ride the wave of the moment. She stood still and became the reason it existed. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching, in studios, classrooms, kitchens, buses, that clarity can be a form of courage, and stillness can be the loudest act of defiance. That night didn't change politics, but it changed something else. It nudged the culture. It held up a mirror, not just to Candace Owens, but to all the voices who speak louder when they're uncertain, who replace vulnerability with branding, who forget that silence doesn't mean surrender. Jasmine didn't tear anyone down. She didn't need to. She simply refused to pretend. And in that refusal, a shift began. Subtle, but real. People started asking different questions, listening with different ears. Not because they were told to, but because they'd felt something they couldn't unfeel.